It was the late 1990s. My colleague and I drove out to the exurbs of Silicon Valley to learn about our research participants' smart home. This participant, I'll call him John, told me that they homeschooled their kids. I was young and naive enough. I didn't have a clue what that typically signified in California in terms of religious affiliation and just a general orientation. So when I asked why they made that decision, John really snarled at me. He was far more interested in showing me his gear than talking about his family, but I explained that we wanted to learn about him as well. And he told me that, well, they didn't support the local school system and its attitude towards alternative lifestyles. So that's when I realized I'm in an environment right now where their values are very different than my own. And that's okay, that's no problem. That's par for the course for this job. So we spent a good long time after that checking out the details of this really incredible smart home system that he'd built, cobbled together, and coded. There's this constant theme in his stories of monitoring and control, of using technology to check on the kids in the other rooms. Still, this was all good information. So we're getting to that part of the interview, the reflective part. We're wrapping up, or nearly so, and John abruptly changes gears mid-explanation. John, of course, none of this really matters because it's all going to burn. My colleague and I are stunned and remain silent. John continued, and now I have a question for you fellas. Have you accepted Christ as your Savior? This is the sort of question I'm utterly unprepared for. In this interview, I knew it was coming. Some part of my body was tense, just from this discussion of the rationale for homeschooling, knowing that somehow I was in this vulnerable situation and it was going to emerge at some point. So while I was dreading it all along, perhaps it came as some kind of relief. When I watched the video later, I saw the most deadpan version of myself I'd ever seen. Well, perhaps that's a question better left for another time. So I was stuck. I couldn't dishonor all the rapport building and honest curiosity that I'd been exhibiting for the past 2 hours, but now we were trapped. My colleague dissolves into helpless reflecting back. I kept waiting for my opening. Well, time to go. But John really wanted to talk to us about what we should be doing and thinking with respect to Christ. And it seemed this went on for a very long time, but we finally made it to the doorway. John asked us to wait and went off to get something. And we should have made a break for it, but we were very struck by the requirements of politeness in our researcher role. He returned with some Bible-related literature, and he exhorted us intensely to follow up. Another eternity, if you will, and we were finally able to step away. We made it to the car, we drove a block, and we pulled over and erupted in hysterical, gasping laughter. It's the laughter of relief, the kind of manic giggling you get from the 10-year-olds that just got away from the angry shopkeeper. And we had some choice words about John once we were safe. This experience was terribly uncomfortable. I couldn't find a way to follow my own values as a researcher and still protect myself from a conversation that felt personally risky. As a researcher, I was interested in and had respect for John's views on his family, his home, education, and the afterlife, but I didn't want to have to reveal my own beliefs or defend them, especially in this setting. I remember very strongly the first time I sat in a hotel bar during a conference and I swapped stories about the bizarre, hilarious, and daunting things that had happened out in the field doing research. It felt good to discover that we all had similarly extreme experiences. And I realized that I was part of a community, and this was a community of practice. I didn't realize it at the time, but what we were doing was sharing war stories. Now, a war story is a specific type of story. It's a personal story about how the storyteller encountered a challenge. Unlike other forms of storytelling, you're meant to be inspired by how the storyteller overcomes the challenge. In war stories, the storyteller themselves doesn't necessarily prevail. This first of two great quotes from Brené Brown in this talk, who sums up a lot of, I think, the ideas here. She says, "We're wired for story. In a culture of scarcity and perfectionism, there's a surprisingly simple reason we want to own, integrate, and share our stories of struggle. We do this because we feel the most alive when we're connecting with others and being brave with our stories." Over the past few years, I've been gathering and publishing war stories by other user researchers. I've worked with these authors so they don't try too hard to turn everything into a lesson. Just tell a story and describe what happens. And across the field of user research, a lot of interesting stuff happens. And in the last year specifically, I've really looked at these stories again and pulled out some of the patterns and themes and what we can learn from those stories. And that's where I'll be spending the rest of our time today. If you look across some of these business books, you'll notice Built to Last, What Would Steve Jobs Do, Lead Like a Boss. Beyond a strangely consistent color scheme, there's a consistent view of the world. And these are all examples of what's known as survivorship bias. And it's a cognitive bias where we focus on the people or things that survived some process, and we overlook things that didn't. And sometimes what doesn't survive a process isn't visible, so you can't study it. But sometimes we just choose not to look at it, like these books. Survivorship bias leads to overly optimistic beliefs about how the world works. It means we don't include the complete set of data, and we think about successes and not failures. And this can lead to a false belief that a particular set of successes has a special property rather than, for example, coincidence. And culturally, this is important too, and why we have books like this. We have a mindset that tells us we should examine and emulate success in order for us to be successful ourselves. Fields like engineering and medicine have incorporated failure analysis formally into their practices. But in design, user experience, research, kind of our stuff, we don't have that same appetite. And if you look at the reward structure explicitly or implicitly in the cultures that we work in, it tends to encourage confident or overconfident success stories rather than humility and reflection. And ironically, those are the qualities that make for successful researchers. The demand that researchers have placed upon them to provide clear and actionable insights means sometimes we set aside these other stories because they're not, quote, valuable. So let's talk about some of the patterns. This is the control room. Any movie that shows us a control room is tipping its hand broadly. Things are very soon going to go very badly out of control. This highly designed system is hubris right on the screen, and we're all going to see what happens when something unanticipated occurs. The intel is wrong. The monster is impervious to our weapons. The enemy agent has spotted a surveillance team. The target is still in the safe house. Whatever it is, the control room represents it's a monument to the planning, systems, routines, and processes and procedures that lead to success. But its brittleness is revealed when what's really required is improvisation. The control room and the inhabitants of the control room are safely in a bunker, a safe house, back at headquarters, but the real action, which is what they watch semi-helplessly on those wall-sized video displays, that real action takes place out in the field. If there's going to be any success today, it's going to be because of the field team that rejects the naivete of the control room. This gap between abstracted plans and the on-the-ground reality, this is a real concern to the researcher. And these war stories remind us that you can't always anticipate what's going to happen out in the field. Ironically, the bonus value of this kind of research is in the things that you can't anticipate, that you don't anticipate, the things that you would never think to ask about. But these are the things you discover once you go into the context that you're interested in. The control room is based on the belief that you can anticipate and design for anything. But the lesson we take from the drama is that we'll fail if we actually believe that. So of course there are war stories about control or about the loss of control. In one story, researcher Diane Laviglio goes on site to speak with participants. In the middle of the interview, their boss comes in and yells at the first participant to get out of there and go into a meeting. Then after 10 minutes, he comes back in and he yells at the other participant. The researchers end up sitting in this conference room alone, and they show themselves out of this business. In another story, Elaine Ann has a Western client with her in Beijing, and her client faints, so they take her to the hospital and have to deal with cross-cultural medical treatment issues. Ryan DeGorder has a story about taking a manager along with him into the field, and despite all of Ryan's preparation, this manager insists on aggressively interrogating the participant. Nicola Nova is doing interviews at a fast food restaurant when a rather large and energetic person confronts them at the table, announcing that he's just been released from prison and he's hungry. Here's a whole story called They Call Me Mister from researcher Elaine Fukuda. I admit I don't have a lot of experience with children, but the opportunity to shadow a patient through an entire day's hospital visit was not one to pass up. The patient, being 13 years old, added another layer of consent and assent, a mythical ethnographic research unicorn of sorts. The goal of shadowing was to understand the experience of the entire visit from start to finish, through multiple provider visits, labs, tests, and waiting times in between. I met the patient and her mother as they were pulling into the parking garage and started the day with a scan. During the next 2 hours, this girl patiently laid in a claustrophobic tunnel and did everything as asked, from changing positions ever so slightly, holding her breath for 30 seconds at a time, and breathing at a specific pace. Having fasted since the previous evening, she was ready for lunch, but she wanted to get everything done before their provider visit, so she and her mother decided to get a blood test done before lunch. We arrived in the pediatrics department, and her mother stood in line to check in while I joined the patient in the waiting area. After a few minutes, a volunteer came over for what I felt was a break in our somewhat awkward small talk. The volunteer was a kind elderly man with a book cart offering free books for patients to take home. The patient, tired from the scan and possibly feeling out of place in the bright and cheerful pediatrics environment, shrugged and said there wasn't anything that she liked. Determined, the volunteer took out a magical coloring book, which colored itself with a flip of the page. She was still not impressed. Then came the pièce de résistance. From the cart, the volunteer pulled out a heavy woven rope and introduced the patient to his friend, Mr. Stick. Mr. Stick had a magical ability, you see. With a grand gesture, he could become taut. In order to turn back into a rope, the patient was instructed to ask, "Mr. Stick, will you go down?" The shade of red across the teen's face had long passed lobster, and she and I stared at each other in disbelief. Her mother was still in line across the way, and as the adult, I felt responsible, but conflicted on what to do. Surely the man had no idea what he was implying. Being a very good sport, she complied, and sure enough, Mr. Stick fell limp. But the volunteer didn't stop there. He turned to me, holding the middle of Mr. Stick, now back in its rigid state. He asked me to tell Mr. Stick to go down, which I did. Nothing happened. The volunteer said I must say please, which I did, and again, nothing happened. He then said, "I guess Mr. Stick doesn't go down if you're not a child." "Hey, I think they're calling your name," I quickly said to the patient, and with that, we escaped the somewhat creepy but well-intentioned volunteer. "That was awkward," she said. It wasn't until after the blood test and during lunch that we were able to debrief and talk about the encounter with this volunteer. I was afraid her mother would be upset that I hadn't intervened sooner. She was shocked, but laughed, wondering if someone could really be that clueless. As I started to explain what had happened, the patient, who had been sitting right next to the volunteer, intervened. "No, its name was Mr. Stiff, not Mr. Stick." Me, "Ooh, that's even weirder." Mother, "I'm really curious how you're going to write this up." So let's talk about some of the things that this story and all these stories about control and loss of control teach us. And there are lessons here for user research. One is that it's okay to walk away from an interview, which I will contradict later. But it's okay to walk away, especially if you've already tried everything you can think of. Sometimes the circumstances are such that you cannot accomplish your research objective. And that trying and failing can be really illustrative. It might teach you about your participants or aspects of their culture, or about your own organization or how your own organization is perceived, or even about this project itself. And if nothing else, it's a chance to have a laugh. Knowing when to walk away from anything, interview or otherwise, is a complicated life skill, and it's not easily codified. You can't say, when X happens, walk away. But it's something to think about being prepared to do and reflecting on. You can call for a timeout. When the interview feels almost completely out of control, you can take a step back and readjust. And one thing you can do is just take a pause. That's like saying, "Give me a moment, please," if you start to feel unsettled. But a timeout is something more extreme. You might say, "Let's all take a break for a few minutes." You shouldn't use this technique prematurely. It is more of a bigger step. By the same token, you don't want to wait too long. When you're too frazzled to reflect and adapt, it's kind of too late to take that pause. Alternatively, you're given breaks by circumstances. Use the breaks that you're given. When the external circumstances disrupt the flow of the interview, use that as an opportunity to step back, readjust, re-energize, and go back in. And keep in mind that the unexpected can reveal bold new truths. That's one of the prized aspects of being out in the field. Things happen you weren't expecting to happen, and they reveal something powerful you would never have thought to look for. Sometimes the unexpected is just a monkey wrench that's you didn't want, like a recently released and hungry prisoner. And you won't know which is which. Is this a monkey wrench, or is this a new insight? Even with experience, you won't know in the moment. And it reminds us that it's important to stay open through the process of doing research. Improvise. And this is often expressed as saying yes and to everything that comes your way. In research, you have to be more selective about what you say yes to. When you're in the field, you can think about improvising as working from a script that's being created on the fly. Now, if you look at how people do improv, those performances don't always proceed gracefully. Sometimes they come to an awkward halt. Improvisers don't consider that failure, and neither should you when you're improvising at any point, and especially in the field. Those awkward moments can happen even if you do everything right. If the script you start with falls flat, you can start creating a new script and pivot to a different conversation. It feels inappropriate for me to be talking about participants in any sort of negative way. Researchers cherish participants. We advocate for them, and we're critical of others who judge participants. But even using that word participant, it masks the fact that we're dealing with people. And anything that we do in our lives that involves people is going to have glitches. The whole process depends on us getting to people who are willing to talk to us, share with us, allow us to observe them, play with our clever toys, and so on. So it's to be expected that sometimes those things don't work out. Sometimes the people we're doing research with can't help us. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they aren't even around when we get there to help us. Sometimes they're just trying to work the system of being a research participant for their own benefit, and sometimes they're just perplexingly, elusively challenging in other ways. I interviewed a man in a large home in an exclusive community who presumably didn't need the honorarium that we were paying, but he was incredibly hostile the entire time, which was unpleasant, but it also was confusing because I couldn't understand why he agreed to do something that he obviously did not want to do. I interviewed another man in an apartment building where the lobby smelled of urine, and he didn't own the credit card that he told me that he owned, and he explained that his aspirations in life were to get myself a rich bitch. I interviewed an exceptionally friendly person who was filled with detailed stories but had absolutely zero insight about themselves, and he was unable to reflect or even explain anything. The interview never went beyond him simply reporting facts. I was led into a woman's apartment to interview her, and while she's letting me in, she's finishing up a phone call, scheduling her next interview for a different study. So during this interview, after hearing about some other apartment in another city where her children supposedly lived, we asked to see some of the activities she does on the computer, and she opened up a folder named Portigal to show us examples. As far as we could tell, none of what she told us was true, and she was a known frequent flyer in the San Francisco user research scene. I recently interviewed a very forthcoming Silicon Valley executive in his home as he described his own side business in a way that utterly distressingly contradicted everything he had told the recruiter about himself. When it starts to dawn on me that my participant is critically different from what I was expecting, it's very uncomfortable. I feel upset for having screwed up, whether I didn't take care of the recruiter or I wrote a bad screener, whatever I did to let this person get into the study. It must be my fault, is what I start to feel. And really, it's devastating to think that I'm face-to-face with someone, I'm listening intently, I'm building rapport, and yet they lied to the recruiter and they're lying to me right now. The practice of research is built on this presumption of honesty. And what do I do with someone who thinks nothing of boldly lying? It breaks the whole process. It's easier to blame myself or something that went wrong with the recruiter than confront the idea, to say nothing of actually confronting this participant. In one of the war stories, Jerry Gaffney recruited home improvement enthusiasts, and he ends up at the home of Mr. W., who is actually more of a home neglect enthusiast. In another story, Leo Frischberg travels to Bangalore from Portland, Oregon, and despite all of the careful planning to get in front of actual users and see the work happening, he's at first presented to a manager who prefers to sit in a conference room and describe his version of what the work processes should be and what the equipment challenges are, rather than actually let them see the users doing their work. Here's a story by Cordy Swope. IDEO, New York City, early 2010. I had been summoned from Europe to lead a project about the future of education in the US. There's never a shortage of people in New York, and recruiting there offers many delights. For instance, New York is only one of several places where it is possible to recruit for impossibly specific profiles like seeking 3 single dads who have volunteered with their children at a local charity organization within the past 2 weeks and also must struggle with their gender identity and make at least $150,000 American per year. In this area, if you're a 1 in a million, by definition, there are at least 22 of you. Our recruiter used Craigslist for most projects and straight away found us one of our targets, a working mother who had successfully completed a bachelor's degree online while raising a family. I had a new team, and my associate design researcher was an eager, empathic, and articulate ethnographer during her first project at IDEO. We headed out to Inwood in Brooklyn for our first site visit, hoping to get insights from this working baccalaureate mom. During the ride, I played the senior mentor guy, offering advice about doing ethnography in a design context. We arrived at the address in Inwood, an obscure part of Brooklyn that looks like a sad, dilapidated part of Queens that in turn tries to look like a nondescript suburb of Long Island. We were buzzed into the building, walked up to a door, and were greeted by a large woman with a curly red mane of hair. Her name was Roberta, but call me Bert. She let us in. The apartment was dim. It smelled of litter box mixed with burnt beef stew that Ramon, Roberta call me Bert's husband, had overheated on the stove. The dingy plaster walls were covered with old shopping lists written in a mangled scrawl that suggested vaguely menacing pathologies and personality disorders suffered by their author. The sofa we sat on smelled of cat piss, and the living room offered up no pretense of ever having been cleaned. We sat up straight, made eye contact in that standard pious, non-judgmental manner that earnest ethnographers often adopt. We began the paperwork. We were offered water and politely declined. I asked her about her work, family, free time, all the perfunctory questions before we got into her college experience. Since I was the seasoned professional, I led the discussion. Tell me a story about your favorite class. Did you make friends with your classmates? Do you still keep in touch? Since my associate was taking notes, I focused on keeping the discussion moving and letting Roberta call me Bert lead us to all sorts of exciting insights. The trouble was she didn't. Oh, I don't remember much about that class, she said about her favorite statistics course she took just before graduating 18 months ago. Yeah, I pretty much kept to myself because I had to work and raise a family, you know. I nodded my head earnestly. I began asking her questions about change. Do you view your daughter's education differently now that you have got a degree? Not really, she said, as her daughter ate ice cream from a container while watching a YouTube video about dogfighting. We eventually went on our way, and once out the door, I was about to launch into the debrief. Since I was the experienced one, I was going to teach my associate a simple time-honored 20-minute structure I often use for debriefs. Interesting behaviors and motivations, and drivers and problems, and frustrations and opportunities. I noticed that she was grimacing. What's wrong? I asked. That was a waste, she replied. What do you mean? I asked. She lied. She never went to college. I was gobsmacked. She was absolutely right. There were no interesting behaviors. There were no drivers or motivations. There were no problems or frustrations. There were no opportunities. There was no diploma. It was packed away somewhere. We returned to the office. Another colleague was leading a project in men's fashion and desperately trying to recruit shop-along dyads of couples in their 40s and 50s where wives selected the husband's clothes. She said they'd already recruited one couple on Craigslist, and their name was Roberta from Inwood, Brooklyn. It goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Good recruiting is essential. And what do I mean by good recruiting? Well, you can screen for softer qualities besides demographics or product ownership, like articulateness and engagement. The research job in the interview is to probe and follow up, to ask good questions, to help draw out a participant who maybe is reticent. But there's a baseline of social interactivity that you can establish, and below that, this type of interview might be a lost cause. For example, during the screening process, you can ask them to tell a story as a way to gauge how easily and how well they express themselves. You can work with a recruiter to arrange interviews, but your first job after the interviews are scheduled can be to do an introductory phone call during which you can assess that participant's suitability. The more you invest in the fieldwork, the more you should consider backup plans. It's one thing to drive across town for a no-show participant. It's quite another to fly all the way to another continent. And we have a story about that in the archive. Even discussing with your team how you might handle the unexpected can give you some preparation if you need to improvise for recruits. You can also recruit additional participants who get a reduced incentive if they aren't interviewed, in case your scheduled participants cancel or turn out not to be suitable. Just accept that failures will happen. But a key element of interviewing people in the field is that you can't always see what's being revealed by the experience that you're having at the time. The story of Mr. W is one where he turned out to be very valuable, but at the time it seemed like a failure. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes these failures turn out to be inspiring or informative in other ways that you had expected they would be, and you can't tell at the moment what those are. If you find yourself challenged to engage your participant in the interview you would hope to conduct, look for a way to change the topic or the conversation or however you're interacting with them to something that's more engaging to them. Meet them where they are. This may end up as a bridge back to the topics that you were planning to discuss, or it may reveal an analogous perspective or other attitudes that you can apply yourself back to the topics you're coming in with. I'll contradict my previous recommendation. If an interview is going badly, stick with it anyway. You've made the investment in time to get to that interview. You've done the work to recruit this participant. You still have to pay them an incentive. By the time things are well and truly hopeless, you might be able to get back an hour of your day. But what a great opportunity to get creative with your interview techniques. You have nothing to lose at this point. Maybe you'll get somewhere and maybe you won't. Don't assign blame if you meet a dishonest participant. It's hard enough to try to learn from a participant, and when you start to feel that something's wrong with a situation, try not to add the additional distraction of worrying about how did we get here, how did this happen? If you're a basically honest person, and this would be a weird type of work to be doing if you weren't, trying to have an authentic person with a calmly dishonest person is very unsettling. Blaming yourself or blaming others and being frustrated or disappointed is a way to avoid confronting the the possibility. You focus on the blame rather than acknowledging something that's just truly uncomfortable. But you can't ascertain in that moment during the interview what the heck happened. Was there an oversight in the process? Was it a mix-up, or is it outright deception? So you have to leave until later the opportunity to get that resolution and carry on. Again, you really have nothing to lose by continuing to carry on. Alert systems like DEFCON attempt to synthesize enormously complex factors into a linear amount of danger. Danger is like everything else. We want a simplistic understanding of a complex situation. And we know that reality is more complex and nuanced, but we can use something like DEFCON as a device for raising awareness and for facilitating dialogue. So I'll propose a peril alerting system for user research for fieldwork. Number 1, social discomfort. Number 2, physical discomfort. Number 3, suspicion of hidden danger. Number 4, fear of visible danger. Number 5, actual danger. Now, as human beings, we have fight or flight reflexes wired into our brains. And so that means we easily mix up those different states. We might feel something that we identify as fear, the need to flee from having an awkward conversation. And this general feeling that we can get of being outside our comfort zone sometimes escalates inside ourselves to a desire to be anywhere else but this point where we're out of our comfort zone. And that means we start thinking about fleeing. That's what fight or flight is about. And we started to talk more lately in lots of contexts in our lives about violent speech, unsafe environments, Those terms acknowledge that experiencing emotional harm is different from physical harm, but it's as valid as physical harm. But I think for researchers, emotional harm is more of a gray area. Our job is about getting out of our comfort zone because that's where we learn the most. So given that, how do we assess the risks we're facing, and what do we do about it? What obligation do we have to protect ourselves? What should we tolerate? In one of the war stories, Lindsay Moore is greeted by a participant who says something about, "Now that I have 3 pretty girls here, it would be better if you didn't have your clothes on." In an epic story, Michael Griffiths was conducting in-home research in China when the mother came home and flipped out, yelling at everyone. So they eventually left the home, left the interview, but the argument continued out into the street. So the research team got in the car and drove away, but the woman called the recruiting company and the police. The police were potentially going to pursue them to the next town. Mobile phone calls are going back and forth between the drivers and the researchers and the police. It's just it's just an epic, horrible story. When studying buyers of high-end cars, researcher John McNeil is taken for a high-speed, drug-fueled drive around Miami, where his client is bullied by the participant into accepting a private lap dance. John realizes eventually that his client is gay, and after the interview concludes, John doesn't see him again for the rest of the project. Here's a story by Gavin Johnson. The nature of what you're studying and the importance of context is something one should never forget. This is particularly true when the product you're focusing on is a fusion of caffeine-infused malt liquor, Red Bull, and Tang, and is primarily consumed by hipster 20-somethings as they pre-funk on a Friday night. On the surface, it sounds like one of the kind of things that you hear about or read about and say, "Oh, poor you," with more than a touch of sarcasm. And to be fair, I'll be the first to admit that doing ethnographic research on a topic like this is decidedly more enjoyable than, say, online tax preparation. Or at least it is until it's 4 a.m. in the Bronx, the subway has stopped running for the night, and your shoulder is coated in a quickly freezing film of someone else's vomit. This is when knowing your limits and having a backup plan for getting back to the hotel or out of jail becomes as important as the camera, the training, or your research experience. The fieldwork began with a party hosted by 2 young women so obsessed with this drink that they had actually dressed as cans of the product for Halloween. They were experts at finding an amazing number of uses for it, from turning empty cans to art to cooking with the neon liquid. Imagine a drink made with a mix of the god-awful stuff and strawberry ice cream. As the party heated up and the list of participants grew, simply keeping up was difficult. Notepads were quickly filling up and batteries were drained. Normally, the idea is that you drink one of these concoctions to kick off the evening and one late in the evening, say midnight, to keep the party going. But that wasn't the case with these folks. No, rather than being used to supplement the other drinks throughout the evening, the stuff was consumed exclusively, leading to what they hoped would be mad adventures and general mayhem. Being long past my partying days, I took it in stride, assuming it was just bravado. Fieldwork demands vigilance, so if capturing the full context of use meant losing a little sleep and stinking of cigarettes, so be it. But it turned out to be that much more was going to be required. At about 1 a.m., as one of the roommates found a corner in which to sleep away the night, the other grabbed 2 more cans of the stuff, 3 of her friends and me, and then headed out the door, intent on getting to an obscure club in the Bronx. After a walk through a foot or so of snow, we hopped on the subway and headed out of Brooklyn. As it turned out, the obscure club was in a warehouse in a deserted neighborhood. At this point, my camera battery had run dry, my notebook was full from cover to cover, and I was running out of steam. As I contemplated calling a cab, I realized that I was too far away, had limited cash, and was in a neighborhood that no cab driver would have driven to in the first place. So I decided to continue on with my participants. In for a penny, in for a pound, as they say. Not long after, about 3 a.m., my key informant and one of her friends tracked me down because I'd lost them half an hour earlier in the crowd and asked if I was ready to go because one of their cohort had consumed a little too much booze. We headed for the door. Unfortunately, instead of making it to the subway for the last late-night train, it was half an hour later, I found myself, my host, and her friends sitting in a subway station that was in disrepair. 30 minutes later, after that, sitting on a bench in the frigid subway station, waiting for the 5 a.m. train, The friend who had downed a bit too much decided that it was a good time to paint my shoulder with the day-glow contents of her stomach. The decision to stick with it ultimately resulted in some breakthrough insights and a very happy client, so I can't complain. But all things being equal, I would do things differently today. The experience helped remind me that it's important to know when to bow out and how you're going to do it. It reminded me that it's important to set limits on what you're willing to do in the name of research, rather than pushing yourself to the breaking point, putting yourself in harm's way, or being party to what may be questionably legal behavior. Of course, 6 months later, I was sitting in a 130-degree attic with HVAC guys for 10 hours at a time. Sometimes it takes years for these lessons to take hold. So here's some lessons for us. Don't go into the field alone. Having a partner help you to assess the situation will help you make good decisions. Again, you can deal with your fight or flight reflexes. You can establish a code word or a phrase to signal to each other that the interview needs to end in case there's a safety issue. Let someone else know where you're going and when you're planning to be done, and after you wrap up the interview, send them a text message. Before you go in the field, know what your limits are and know what the limits of your colleagues are, and those may be different. You can use tools like Google Street View or something else to give you a visual of your destination in the neighborhood, so you have some sense of what to anticipate and prepare yourself. Think about being a participant in this research, not merely an observer. If the respondent is causing your unsafe feelings, ask them to stop doing something that's unsafe. Consider the difference between uncomfortable and unsafe. Are the signifiers of low income, which, where I am, you might see things like derelict cars or unmaintained property. Are those signifiers of danger or just different environmental norms? So be prepared to consider that. Very pragmatically, be mindful of what you take in the field and how you display it. Mobile phones, video cameras, prototypes, cash incentives, those are all potential targets. Remember that the interview is a fixed duration. An uncomfortable situation will be over and done with in a couple of hours. If it doesn't hurt, ask yourself if it's something you can put up with. Practice your observer's distance. By that I mean, when something makes you uncomfortable, make a note of your own reaction. Your own reaction is data. And then finally here, make sure to debrief with your teammates about their feelings of discomfort, their feelings of fear, their feelings of danger. It's crucial that you process these experiences so that you can understand and accept that you have different perceptions among the team, and to clarify for each of you and together what those differences are and what they mean. Across these stories and all the rest, I want to emphasize that it's okay that these researchers messed up in some way. We've all messed up. I've messed up many times. You've probably messed up. We all probably will mess up again. It's inevitable and it's okay. Now, in no way am I saying that you do anything but your best work always, but I'm acknowledging the demands of reality. There's a messy human reality at the core of research. That reality can sometimes exceed the level of your best work, and that's just the way it is. But why I'm doing this and what I think the value of this project is by digging into these war stories, reflecting on your reaction to those stories, and discussing these stories with others, it's a way to get past self-recrimination. And it's a very unhelpful behavior. And it's a way to focus more on how do we continue to learn the craft of research. And as you look at these stories, you can have empathy for the storyteller, you can have empathy for the other people in the story, and even in these stories, you can have empathy for yourself as you think about what these stories mean and what your own experiences are. The fact is that failing sucks, but these war stories give you 3 ways to overcome that. 1, lessons from others' experiences that can limit your future failures. 2, a big stack of permission slips for your inevitable failures to come. And 3, a deeper focus on tools that can help you learn from failures. Crucially, if more elusively, these stories reveal the priceless data that comes from being out in the field. The elements of research that aren't findings, but are the ways in which we are personally and permanently changed. When you step outside of your comfort zone, you are heading off to war in a small but meaningful way. You're facing two stages of risk. The first from whatever unknown awaits out there, and the second from the likelihood that you will return from that war forever changed. These war stories remind us of the humanity at the very root of user research. The people doing research are human, the people we want to learn from are human. And I use the word human to stand in for the many qualities that led to these stories. Emotional, vulnerable, unpredictable, flawed, ambitious, error-prone, insecure, curious, patient, judgmental, messy, anxious, persistent, reflective, thoughtful, and kind. These stories teach us that researchers are always learning to do research, and that learning goes beyond a set of methods. We must grapple with ourselves as humans in a world of humans. We can and we should share more stories about our work and how and when things go wrong. And here's the second Brené Brown quote. Vulnerability is not about winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. This is the stories today, and some of what many, many more stories are part of a book coming very soon. I'm almost able to tell you the date, but I can't tell you the date. It's a Rosenfeld Media book, and we'll have a title. We'll have a cover soon. The title is the same as this talk: Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries. Also, there's my other book about user research, interviewing users, which may have been one of the giveaways. I didn't see what we were giving away. And there's lots of resources on that page that you can also check out to bring into your own user research practice. And then the other thing I'll pitch you guys today is Dollars to Donuts, a podcast that I've been doing for a couple of years. Larissa's predecessor does a really wonderful interview with Greg Bernstein. You could kind of triangulate what she shared today and what some of the historical practices were a couple of years ago that Greg talks about. Anyway, Portigal.com/podcast. It's all people that are like you, Larissa, leading user research practices inside these organizations, and a lot of the best practices and problems that they've solved. And you addressed a lot of it, I think, in your talk today, but there's more there. So check that out. So we're going to hear a few stories, but I think just to keep in mind that stories are things we all have. You have stories, your colleagues have stories. Beyond today, tell those stories. Whether it's over drinks or more formally in a workshop, tell those stories. Write them up, publish them yourselves, submit them to my archive. The more we share stories of failure, the more we normalize thoughtful and transparent consideration of our work. These storytellers that I've worked with have bravely and honestly shared their own experiences. You don't have to feel alone with your mistakes. Instead, you can join their illustrious ranks. All it takes is a story. Thank you.
Hi, I've got the mic and there's no cable on it, so I can visit you. Who has a story that they'd like to share, a war story, a bit? You can raise your hand and I'll run over to you. Anybody dare to share? All right, cool.
Yeah, I was doing an app with the company I was with before, and that app was for a client, and they had a company that they were working with regards to screening users for user tests. So they had screened a bunch of users and found 10 that I was testing with. And of course, one of the screening criteria was that they had to own a smartphone. And everybody said yes to that. And then when I was in the middle of the test with one of these guys, an elderly gentleman, very, very pleasant guy, I got the suspicion that he was not particularly, he didn't know smartphones very well. And one of the reasons that I found out was because at some point he said that he was really happy that his phone had APS. And I said, APS, and it turned out he meant GPS. And that's when I said to him, well, do you have your phone with you? Could you please find it for me? So he found it for me, and it turned out it was one of those phones for elderly people, the Doro. And that just blew my mind, because when they had been screened, they hadn't been aware, the company hadn't been aware that not everybody knows what a smartphone is. He thought he had a phone that was quite smart, so ergo it was a smartphone. So he said yes. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that he was outside of our user group, so I just finished the test with him, and that was it. And I just took everything from that test out of the data afterwards. But yeah, it just goes to show that there's no end to what you have to specify to people.
That's great.
Thank you. Any other want to share? Who's bold enough? Aha. I think I can guess which story this is.
Yeah, actually, I also have a few, so I don't even know which one to say, but maybe I tell one, which I didn't know while the session was on that it will be a war story. It was just really, really weird. So already after 10 minutes, I had this suspicion that something is not okay here. It was a really nice lady, but somehow I didn't, like, there was no information in what she was sharing, and it was all general, and sometimes I felt that she was actually saying things she thought I wanted to hear, but we never heard that before. Like, she would do anything on her mobile phone that nobody ever would do. And then after like 30 minutes, I really had this suspicion that she's making up this whole thing, that this is just, you know, like, nothing is true from what she's saying, but, you know, like, you cannot say that, so you finish this session as if everything was okay. And then I also shared this video with my research colleagues saying, like, I don't want to tell you what is wrong, but I think something is wrong. What do you think? And they all said, yeah, it seems like she's making up all these things. And we did some research, and we found out she was not doing that job for 20 years. She was saying that she just did something last year and 2 weeks ago or a week ago. So it turned out that she did it for the incentive that we was offering. So she really wanted to be part of this research, but she made up the whole thing. And yeah, the whole thing, so what you can bring back from that, so if you hear too general things, no information, you know, everything seems to be too nice, you might be suspicious that it's not true.
Thank you. Hey, all right. Oh, I know this one.
Okay, so this one happened quite recently. And I'll start by saying don't ever schedule a user research session on 4/20 in San Francisco. That was my first mistake. So we had this participant come in. According to the screener, he met all of our criteria. We were really excited to meet him. He came in the office. He was quite late, but he texted me that, oh, I'm running late, but I'll be there really soon. I'm stuck in traffic. And so he arrives, and he starts, we start by asking him some general questions. It turns out that he doesn't quite meet the criteria that we had asked, and we're thinking, okay, well, we can, still get the usability part of the test from him. He doesn't have to be that qualified to do that. And it turns out, while he's using our website, he can't even perform basic things like scrolling up and down or like clicking on certain things. And he's like, this computer is just not working right. Oh, maybe it's like the vegetables that I was chopping before coming here. Maybe there's something on my fingers. And then he, like, literally, there's a camera right there recording the session, and he turns around and he says, well, maybe it's the cannabis I had before coming here. I mean, it is 4/20. And afterwards, our recruiter was on vacation, so it took a couple of days before we gave him the incentive. And during that time, he complained to our customer support and said he was going to come to our office and threatened us and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, yeah.
Wow.
Thank you. Who's in the back row that has a story while I'm here? took a lot of effort to come back here. Oh, in the back row.
So this is another San Francisco story. We were out there to talk to some people who use productivity software, and this gentleman really fit the criteria, working for a startup, and then we met up at the place, which turned out that, yes, it is his office, but it's a co-working space, more or less, and they do have meeting rooms, but all of them are occupied. So that wasn't really a good start, and the only place we could sit is the kitchen part of the co-working place where everybody was coming for drinks and food every 5 minutes or maybe every 2 minutes, opening the fridge, brewing coffee, which was very loud. And on top of that, this gentleman who was really enthusiastic to do the research when he talked to the researcher is suddenly socially super awkward, very distracted, and it wasn't like I felt threatened. It felt more like he's super intimidated by the situation of having a product manager, a researcher, and a couple of other folks facing him, talking to how he uses software. So any question we had, he had a maybe 2-word answer to, and it was hard to balance, like, do you walk out of this situation? Do you ask him if he feels uncomfortable, to make him feel even more uncomfortable, or try to stretch it at least 20 minutes so that he doesn't feel that he's super weird? And he helped us, and he earned the incentive. So it was hard to make that call, and in the end I just chose to battle on, cover what's in the interview guide, try to open it up into areas that might be more relevant to him, or might resonate with him, or might help to open him up, but none of those worked, and all I could see is just the watch progressing and me just making up questions, and I really, like, probably inspired by your book, made it an exercise of how creative I can get with asking questions in a very awkward situation. And I think what was most interesting is that the way you have to manage other people who come with you to the field after this, it was a very difficult situation almost for each and every one of us, and everybody felt like we need a drink or we need to have a conversation about what just happened, even though there were no knives pulled, there was nothing like extraordinary discomfort, but it was emotionally discomforting.
Right.
Thank you for sharing. We have time for one more story. Back row? All right, okay, cool. Hold on. I need a boomerang mic.
So actually I'm feeling pretty bad because listening to all these war stories, I don't have a war story to share. But I'm in the creation area. And I rely on data. And I want to share my frustration, actually. I'm working with a client for about 2 years now. And they expect me to, like, transcend, be like a god, be everywhere, know everything. And whenever I'm telling them that I need data to work on, they say, yeah, it's pretty important, but let's do it later. Let's find out that data later. And my question is, do you have any tips about how we can sell this need? How we can convince them to support us and give us the data that we need? Thank you.
So if I get the last, I don't know if I get the last word or not, but can I just reflect on the stories? I mean, I love hearing all these stories, and and I don't know how about you, as I'm hearing these stories, I start like unspooling them a little bit, like, oh, well, that's because of this, or you could have done this, and da-da-da-da. But I think it's cool we didn't use our time to fix any of those things, and we just sort of heard what happened. Maybe they're fixable, maybe they're not, maybe there's causes, maybe it's this, it's just like this is the stuff that happens. And I encourage you to keep sharing those things. You can choose when to pull lessons out of them, but not everything is fixable, or maybe it's just don't do it on 420. Whatever it is, so, you know, I think the takeaways can vary, and really thank you for sharing stories just to sort of model that. You know, as far as getting buy-in, I think I don't want to use my time just to address that. I feel like we've had a few great discussions already today about getting buy-in for UX process. I'm just going to look at you guys for getting buy-in for research specifically, UX processes overall. I think anything that I would add to that would, you guys covered that so eloquently from two very different contexts, so I'm just going to leave, the answer to that, your questions, I think has already been spoken to, is what I'll say about that.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you guys.